Today is January 15th, 2026, and my guest is Andrew Fox. I usually give our guests a title like author or journalist or historian. Andrew's a little different. His life experiences are not easily captured in a single word or phrase, so I'm going to give you a piece of his bio. He served in the British Army from 2005 to 2021. He completed 3 tours in Afghanistan, including one attached to the U.S. Army Special Forces. He served in the Parachute Regiment and Special Forces Support Group, with additional tours in Bosnia, the Middle East, and Northern Ireland. After his active service, he spent 3 years as a senior lecturer in the War Studies and Behavioral Science departments at the Royal Military Academy in Sandhurst in the UK. He specializes in defense, the Middle East, and disinformation. And he is a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. Recently, over the last months and year plus, he spent a great deal of time here in Israel, examining the Israel Defense Force, the IDF, in Gaza. This is his second appearance on EconTalk. He was last year in September of 2024, where we talked about how the war was going. I thought it might be useful to get his views a year later and discuss his recent report for the Henry Jackson Society, which we will link to, Tactical Lessons from Gaza. Andrew, welcome back to EconTalk.
Thanks very much. It's great to join you.
And I want to emphasize the date we're recording this on, January 15th, 2026. Last night, the airspace of Iran was closed for a number of hours. People were speculating that there would either be attacks on Iran, from Iran to Israel to Qatar, and suffice it to say, we're at a time where many things are in flux there. And by the time this airs in a few weeks, many things may have changed that we will not be discussing because we are recording this on January 15th. So I want to start by understanding what you've been doing when you come to Israel and Gaza. And I want to get understanding of what your conclusions are based on. What have you been doing besides obviously talking to a lot of people? I'm sure you've had some good Israeli wine and cheese and hummus, but you've taken on a very challenging task. And as far as I know, you're one of the few. So tell us what your experience has been.
I've had some truly terrible Israeli wine as well, so I've got it's about a 75-25 hit rate, but yeah, that doesn't stop me persisting, so it's all good. The last 2 years have been a really interesting journey into this space. I was lecturing at Sandhurst. My academic qualifications were a master's in psychology, where I looked at the psychologies of leadership and also of disinformation. And then a war studies master's where I focused specifically on the Middle East. And then, of course, a war in the Middle East began with loads of strategic questions and loads of disinformation. So I had plenty to write about, and I was headhunted by the Henry Jackson Society to do just that. So I kind of found myself in a new job as a conflict researcher. But it also kind of came from, I'd been very vocal since the start of the war about anti-Semitism and the raging kind of obvious disinformation that was coming out about the Gaza war right from the start. That got me an invitation on a trip to Israel. From there, I built up my network of sort of contacts, and I worked quite hard to do that. Find people who talk to me, and work out who was who in the academic and the military spaces, who was good to talk to, who could offer you that information that nobody else was getting in it, and it kind of turned into a niche for me. So I managed to get into Gaza 3 times during the war with the IDF. Once was with the high-level military group, which is a crowd of retired, very senior officers from around NATO and other European countries, and we wrote an amicus curiae brief for the International Criminal Court off the back of that to refute some of the allegations against Netanyahu and the Defence Minister Gallant. The second trip was again, kind of laid on for me, if I'm honest. It was, I literally asked the spokesman's department if I could go and visit the troops, because I've always been really interested in this from a soldier's eye view. There are big strategic questions, there are big policy questions, there's all that stuff, which is interesting. But actually, I noticed that nobody was really talking about the troops. And if you want to know what's really happening in a war zone, it's the soldiers who fight it that are good to speak to, rather than the generals who sit in their offices kind of a bit further back. Not to denigrate the generals, who do an important role, and you can't have an army without one. But when it comes to, the tooth and nail fighting, it's the troops that you need to talk to. So that was really interesting, and, developed my network a bit further there. And then my third visit I was the first neutral international observer to go and visit and film a Gaza Humanitarian Foundation distribution from start to finish, which sort of inadvertently turned into a global exclusive. And the footage I shot went absolutely worldwide, which was quite cool. So that's the access I've had. When you go, particularly through the spokesman department with the IDF, you kind of, they're the official party line. They have, they're fighting their own information war. You have to not take them with a pinch of salt. I'm not saying that at all. But you do have to kind of divine, using your experience and your knowledge, what they're not telling you. And I don't blame them for not telling me, because they're doing a job. But it's my job to try and kind of find the gaps and work out what the truth actually is. And so the paper you're talking about, I kind of slightly naughtily cut out the higher echelons of command in the IDF completely and went to my network of soldiers who would talk to me. And I kind of cross-referenced their accounts of things with OSINT and open source intelligence and what we could glean from kind of maps. And there's some pretty impressive tracking of the war that's gone on in the open source intelligence space community. So there's some pretty good ways of checking what you're being told. And of course, you cross-reference the soldiers' accounts with each other to see where they contradict, where they complement each other, and that kind of thing. And only right at the end did I give the paper to the IDF's lessons learned branch, because frankly, I didn't want to get anything. If I'd made a mistake, I'd like it to be called out. Fortunately, I hadn't actually. There were very few things they picked up in there. But also, I didn't want to get anyone hurt and breach operational security, or throw the IDF under a bus in any way by revealing secrets that perhaps might harm soldiers going forward. So I made sure there was nothing in there that kind of crossed that line. But that's really the only input the IDF had into it, and I don't think anyone else in the world has come up with a paper that this comprehensive on how the IDF actually fought in Gaza. It's been incredibly underreported by the world's press. A lot of sort of pro-Israel academia tends to just stick to the spokesman's department line without interrogating it too hard. And I've tried very hard to get past that. So I think this paper is pretty unique, and I'm very proud of it.
But I want to talk more generally about both your perceptions of the war and the IDF's behavior, which has come under unbelievable criticism. As you point out, you just suggested you might be the only person who's produced something remotely like this. But one of the criticisms of Israel during this war has been that they did not allow journalists, quote, into Gaza. And you're something of an exception. You're not literally a journalist, but you are effectively a journalist now. Why do you think Israel did not have more neutral observers to vouch for their behavior? In particular, Israel's claimed they've tried to minimize civilian casualties. They've warned civilians of when attacks are coming. They've leafleted and so on. And yet when we look at Gaza, and the world has looked more than any, I'd say, conflict maybe in modern times, what they see is incredible physical devastation of the infrastructure of buildings and streets. Occasionally they see grotesque bodies and other things, but all of it is sort of filtered through a very limited lens, either on the Israeli side of what they're publishing or on the Palestinian, the Gazan side, where, we're looking at hand-shot iPhone videos of unknown credibility. Some of it I assume is real, and some of it I'm not sure. React to that.
Yeah, it's so tricky because it's such a contested information space, and I've written a whole paper on that as well. It's called Information Maneuver, again, Henry Jackson Society paper, which talks about this information war and how it's been fought. And the lessons from Gaza paper does address the journalist piece. And I would, when it comes to my role in that information space, all I'm trying to do is be fair and write about the IDF as I would about the British Army or the American Army or the Dutch Army or the Sri Lankan army or whoever you want to pick, because I think there's such a skew in the way the IDF is reported on, almost in the sense that, perfection is expected. And if they drop anywhere short of complete perfection, then somehow that's the worst thing that ever happened. And that's just an unrealistic way of looking at war. We can go back to Clausewitz and he talks about the chaos and the friction. And the fact that war is deeply messy. And then, the fact I've been to war myself 3 times in Afghanistan, and I've seen firsthand just how brutal and tragic and awful war is. It's very different to, say, Call of Duty or, the computer game or a Hollywood film. So that's the kind of perspective I've taken on it when it comes to my role in the information war, just to report fairly. And I've not shied away from criticising the IDF where I think it's appropriate. And actually, the IDF have encouraged that. My IDF friends appreciate that. They don't want cheerleaders with pom-poms, saying that they're the best thing that ever happened. They just want to be treated fairly and normally. And when it comes specifically to the journalist issue, I kind of weather vane on this one. Depends what time of day you catch me, because I genuinely see both sides of the argument. On the one hand, we know from the 2014 war, there's very credible third-party journalist reporting talking about how they were intimidated by Hamas on the ground. There's journalists from the Netherlands and India that report on this, so it's not completely divorced from Israeli press. It's third-party stuff, so that's very credible, and I believe those reports, especially as we saw them repeated, not by Hamas, but actually by Hezbollah during this war. I went to a captured tunnel up in Lebanon. It was technically a media outing, but almost nobody went. And I asked a friend of mine, who I won't name, but he's a major international journalist. I said, why is nobody else here? And he told me outright that it's because the networks had their correspondents in Beirut threatened if people went on this trip. So if you go on this trip to the tunnel, we'll hurt your correspondent in Beirut. So it's a very common tactic. It's not just Hamas that do it. And Hamas and Hezbollah are so close, there's no way they're not using the same tactics. But we also know that if anything happened to a journalist on the ground, it would be pinned on the IDF, no matter who was responsible. But on the flip side, my very first firefight in Afghanistan, I had a BBC journalist with me. I joined the battle group prior to a huge assault. She sort of stayed with us in the forming up area overnight. She went forward with us to the line of departure. And then she stayed kind of a bound back whilst we went through the assault. And there's still an article on the BBC website about that, which is kind of cool. And perhaps more of those embeds, certainly with trusted journalists, journalists they know they can trust to be fair. I don't think they want these hagiographies. They want fair reporting, and there aren't many journalists out there that have proven themselves able to do that, which is partially I think a failing of the media, which has harmed their case to get in with the IDF. But yeah, I think a few more kind of eyes on the ground would have definitely helped. And then the final thing I would say, though, that is far harder to do in Gaza than it is in Afghanistan, because in Gaza you have that. I spoke to a Yahalom, the tunnel commandos. I spoke to one of their captains the other day, and he described it as a 720-degree threat in Gaza, just because of the sort of above ground, underground, 360 degrees, sort of horizontal and vertical. So it's a really challenging environment to keep people safe. And when you're fighting, the last thing you want to do is be worrying about where the journo is and, are they in cover, et cetera, et cetera. So I do genuinely see both sides of this argument, and I kind of change my mind on a daily basis about what the best thing to do would have been.
Let's talk about that physical devastation I alluded to. Of course, when Israel finally, the IDF finally went into certain areas late in the war, Gaza City, for example, it was surprising, I think, to me and probably to many people to see it look something like a normal city, and many streets and street scenes and footage that we were able to receive. But when you ask, and I talked to a lot of my students here at Shalem are in the reserves. They're in both Gaza and Lebanon, off and on over the last 2 years, quite a bit. They'll say, well, every house we went into had a tunnel, or every house we went into had weapons, or every house we went into had a set of books that would make your hair curl. Do you think that's true? I mean, the claim is that because of the tunnel infrastructure, it was necessary. It has to be dismantled if it's there for future security. And is it as widespread? Do you have any feel for whether it really is as widespread as Israel is claiming?
Yeah, I mean, what your students are saying tallies with everything I've ever heard from any IDF soldier. And look, Israelis, there's, if that wasn't true, there's no way they'd be able to force people to repeat the party line endlessly. I was at an academic conference with 13 Israeli academics last year, and at any one time there were 26 opinions in the room. This is not a culture that will kind of just repeat the party line because they're told to. In my opinion, in my experience. Yeah. But look. You look at the amount of IEDs that were in Gaza. I was trying to get a figure out of people last week when I was in Israel.
An IED is a booby trap.
Yeah, booby trap, an improvised explosive device. It's what's done the most damage to IDF soldiers in terms of casualties and deaths. It's IEDs that have really hurt them. I was trying to get a figure. The low figure was tens of thousands, as many as 100,000 IEDs. It was the estimate they gave me. And if you then look at kind of the surface area of Gaza, that equates, I did the maths when I got home, and that works out to an IED every half a football pitch. That's how dense this minefield was. And of course, they weren't evenly spread across the strip. They were concentrated in the cities, in the areas where the IDF were fighting. So actually, it's probably way more dense than an IED every 60 meters. And that gives you an answer as to why Gaza looks like it does straight off the bat. Because, the IDF is fighting was fighting a combined arms maneuver operation. This wasn't counterinsurgency where they could go firm every time they found an IED, call the disposal assets forward, wait there while they clear the bomb, and then move on. That's just not tactically viable in the slightest in Gaza. Most of these IEDs were, operated by a Hamas member that was watching the tunnel mouth or wherever it was through a camera that they'd planted. Hamas were an astonishingly adaptive and well improvised enemy when it comes to stuff like this. So straight away that rules out any chance of an ammunition technical officer getting forward to do the old red wire, blue wire thing that you see from the films. So the IDF had to detonate these things, and of course, as soon as they go bang, that's the building destroyed. And when you are literally advancing through a minefield, detonating every mine, that's why Gaza looks like it does. And I think.
Do you think Israel? Do you think Israel had an alternative to that? When the war started, literally on October 7th, that night, or the 8th, or a few days later, I think it was about a week or two later that Israel first started going into Gaza. There's some bombing before that, but there was a debate, not among Israelis so much, but non-Israelis about what to do. I always like to point out that I live in the Middle East. People who visit Israel, it looks a lot like a Western country, and they think that the norms and customs of this part of the world are something like where they come from. They are not. It's a very different set of expectations and all kinds of aspects of culture. But a lot of people said Israel should, if Israel retaliates in an intense way, they will, all they will do is create more support for Hamas. And so certainly by leveling a significant portion of Gaza physically and killing, tragically, tens of thousands of people who are not Hamas, almost certainly, perhaps they have done more harm than good. What's your take on that?
I mean, I think that rests on a false assumption that before the war, Gaza was somehow a kind of neutral population in terms of their attitudes to Israel, and only Hamas in there were the ones who really hated them. I don't think that stands up to any polling that we've seen ever in terms of Gazan attitudes towards a two-state solution or coexistence peacefully with Israel. I don't think there was just a crowd of people who were like, oh, I'm not sure about Israel. Oh, no, they've bombed me now. I hate them. I don't think that has happened at any point during this war. This is a population who've been, in many cases, indoctrinated by the school system or by UNRWA to loathe, hate, and despise not only Israel, but the Jews generally. And you've alluded already.
UNRWA being the UN, United Nations refugee organization has somehow persisted for 77 years. And they run the school system. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, so the UN Relief Works Agency, there are people in there who very few are neutral towards Israel, even before this war. So the idea that you've somehow now turned the population that already hated you against you further, I think, is kind of irrelevant. It's a flaw in military thinking, where you map conflict A onto conflict B, and you say, right, because conflict A went like this, conflict B will go like this, and I think that's really the wrong way to look at lessons from one conflict to another. And in this instance, what we're seeing is Western commentators taking our counterinsurgency doctrine from Iraq, Afghanistan, Northern Ireland, and trying to apply it to a situation where it really doesn't fit. So I kind of reject that one. In terms of options the IDF had on the table, look, I spoke to the defence minister about this firsthand, and his point was, look, it's the Middle East. You have to be strong. If you have a choice between being liked and being strong, you choose being strong. It's a mentality thing. It's a psychology thing when it comes to the Middle East that I think a lot of Western commentators just don't understand. And that has informed that, those flawed assumptions have informed a lot of really subpar, frankly, commentary on this conflict, especially when it comes to Gaza. But let's go back to 7th, 8th, 9th of October 2023 and just stop for a second and think about what was on the ground there. You have 1,200 people lying dead. You have hundreds more where you don't know where they are. Are they bodies? Are they in Gaza? You don't know. You've got rockets coming in from the north from Hezbollah. You're now worried about Judea, Samaria, and the West Bank. What's going to happen there? Syria is still a mess, so you're worried about that. You've got the Houthis down in Yemen making threats. And you've got Iran as the sort of spider at the center of the web. You are under siege from all sides if you're Israel. And I think the only option on the table at that point really is to punch back as hard as you can. Now, what does that punch look like? Could they have done just targeted strikes and left it there? Potentially, but that doesn't remove the threat of future assaults from Gaza into Israel. We've seen that repeated in previous conflicts, so Guardian of the Walls or any of the other ops that have taken place in Gaza since 2005. That's essentially what Israel did. A few airstrikes, a little bit of ground maneuver, and then stop. That didn't make Israel any more safe and actually led to 7th of October, you can make the case. So Israel took the opportunity, took the decision to get in there and dismantle Hamas's terror capabilities methodologically. And unfortunately, when those terror capabilities are embedded in every square inch of the Gaza Strip, when you have as many as 1,000 miles of tunnels underneath the ground, when you have 57,000 tunnel entrances and they're digging more whilst you're fighting, when you have IEDs and arms caches and rat runs between houses in pretty much every house you come to, unfortunately, to destroy that, you're going to have to take Gaza to pieces, and that's what's happened. And you can make the case, I think, as a final point, that the IDF have approached this mercilessly when it comes to Hamas. I don't think they've been merciless when it comes to evacuating civilians, because they have done that, and they, probably to a greater extent than actually they needed to, under international law anyway. Notwithstanding that law and legal and moral are two very different things. But they've certainly approached Hamas and their capabilities with a sort of merciless approach where they've just ground yard by yard, systematically dismantling everything in front of them. And so we just see the destruction. And I think it boils down to one thing. What's the political end state for this war? It was to remove the threat to Israel, which they've basically done. I don't see any other tactical way of doing that.
Let's talk about that, because that's what I wanted to turn to next. In many ways, I wrote an essay, which I'll link to, when shortly after the death of Sinwar, I mourned the fact that he was not alive to see the full extent of his handiwork, and I viewed it as an extraordinary example of the economic principle of "and then what." He struck a tremendous blow against Israeli security, state of mind. People in this generation may never get over it. It was such a horrific attack on October 7th, and filmed, and various people have seen various levels of the atrocities that Hamas themselves filmed. And the more you see of them, the more disturbing they are. And but look what ultimately came of that so far. Hezbollah basically destroyed, more or less, in the possibility for the first time in forever that Lebanon could have a real country free of Hezbollah and Iranian influence. Syria turned into a much less dangerous state to the state of Israel, and Israel taking advantage of that and grabbing some very small amount but crucial strategic territory in the Golan Heights, and protecting the native population there from counterattacks, the non-Israeli population. Iran on the verge of collapse, and certainly having endured a devastating blow to their nuclear dreams. And yet, and then there's the and yet Hamas is not disarmed. It is not a ragtag group of teenagers. It's still somehow, despite its leadership being decapitated, sometimes literally, but just a total devastation of their leadership capabilities, they still are functioning. Have we failed? I think Israel, it feels more secure living here, but are we just waiting for the next October 7th? What are the prospects for a genuine removal for a significant period of time of something like we saw on the threat of something like we saw on October 7th?
There's a slightly binary approach to looking at war that I think is a real mistake people make, and that's looking at victory and defeat as if they're tangible things. I much prefer to frame it in a more useful way. I don't think victory and defeat are useful. I think what we're looking at is strategic goals. Have they been achieved or not? And Israel's strategic goals are pretty clear. Secure Israel's borders, return the hostages, and destroy Hamas. Okay, so first one is done. Like, the strategic threat to Israel has been removed. Hamas cannot repeat 7th of October. Their rocket stocks are absolutely minimal. They may get one off, but it's not going to be anything remotely serious. And certainly Iron Dome is more than capable of dealing with it. Which leaves us to the final one, was Hamas destroyed? Well, no, they're not. But they are heavily degraded. They can no longer strike Israel, and they are now presiding over a kingdom that is half of Gaza, where everyone lives in tents and is miserable. That feels like pretty strong achievements of strategic goals right there. Now, does that provide long-term security? Well, the answer is we don't know, because actually, under the Trump ceasefire deal, that is really outsourced to the United States now. And if you go down to the Civil Military Cooperation Center in Kiryat Gat, where I was last week, it's very clear who kind of runs the show down there, and it isn't Israel. It isn't the British. It isn't one of the 27 countries that have provided troops to that center. It's the Americans, quite clearly. They are liaising through Egypt directly with Hamas, or indirectly with Hamas, I should say. They are keeping the violence to minimal levels, and they own the board of peace, and then what happens in Gaza going forward. So it's kind of out of Israel's hands at this point. So in terms of the long-term security of Israel, I think it's safer, certainly for years at least. I think Israel retains the ability to strike back in to Gaza with airstrikes should any serious capability look like being developed by Hamas or any other militant group. But a lot is going to depend on who governs Gaza going forward, and there's so much down there that's not decided on. It's completely unclear as to the way forward in terms of Hamas being disarmed, etc., that we can't make an assessment at this point as to where it goes in the future.
We could spend a long time on this next question, but let's do it fairly quickly. It's fraught with emotion. This past fall and before, very early in the war, in fact, Israel was accused of killing children, either by snipers deliberately targeting, and by children, I mean people under the age of 10, and if not by deliberate murder through the withholding of food. It was alleged many, many times during the conflict of the last 2 years that there was a famine in Gaza, that Israel was using food as a weapon, that Gazans were starving or very close to starvation and death, and that Israel was withholding that food at the border, at crossings, and not letting it through. Tell us what you saw of that firsthand. I know snipers. I know actual snipers, and the idea that they are, bloodthirsty sports killers of children is unfathomable to me. I could be wrong, and I also could be wrong that there are crazy, tragically disturbed people with a gun in their hand who do horrible things under the stress of war. I don't deny that possibility. I very much deny the idea that this was some kind of active policy. But that's my bias based on my casual encounters with Israeli soldiers and reservists. Give me your take, especially your experience at the Global Humanitarian Food Aid, the GHF, that you saw firsthand.
Yeah, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation.
Gaza, sorry, not global. Gaza Humanitarian.
Look, I saw hungry people, but not starving people, I think is my takeaway. They weren't anything like, if you close your eyes and think of famine, I think most of us think of Ethiopia or Biafra or those images that came out of the 80s. Nothing like that at all. Nowhere close. People wanted food, but they didn't look malnourished. And, I've got a raft of photographs and video images to prove it. So that's not just me making it up.
At least where you were.
Yeah, at least where I was. But I was down in Rafah, which is some of the worst destroyed areas. Look, there's a weird inversion during this war, and we're in danger of playing the game a little bit here, because the way allegations usually work is if you make an allegation, you have to give evidence. And then it's on the defending party to refute that or otherwise. At the moment, what we've got is allegations, people making allegations and say, right, refute that. And you're like, well, there's nothing to refute. You've made an allegation, you've not provided any evidence. I've got nothing to refute here. And then by trying to refute it, you kind of play their game because you give credibility to the allegation by taking it seriously. So we're in a real trap here, I think. The flip side is if you don't refute the allegation, then that's the only narrative that runs. So it's a really clever information tactic that the anti-Israel side is using. If you make allegations of starvation, you have to get past the fact that 3,000 calories per day per person on average went into Gaza during the war. Like, that is more than enough for every man, woman, and child in Gaza to be well fed every single day. And so we can conclusively say that the issue is with distribution inside Gaza, not with the supply of food. So the simple facts stack up that way. Why weren't people getting fed? Well, a variety of reasons. It's a war zone. There's a lot of rubble. It's very difficult to get food to some people. And I think that's, if there was any hunger, that's where it was. It was in those isolated pockets where it was exceptionally difficult to get food to. Obviously, you've also got Hamas hoarding the aid, and we've seen video after video of the baby food stockpiles that were in there. And I spoke to someone in Kogat who couldn't understand why there was a shortage of baby food. Because they knew how much powder had gone in, and they just couldn't work out why A and B were not matching up. And since then, we've seen videos released of warehouses stacked full of baby food because it's a high value item, and Hamas can sell it for a good price if they restrict supply. It's basically economics. That's your wheelhouse. So there's all these other factors playing into it. Now, that doesn't mean that Israel didn't do stupid things. And the complete cessation of aid at that point, was it last May? It was unnecessary. It didn't work. It did so much strategic damage reputationally. It gave the enemy as much ammunition as they could have dreamed of. And it was just a foolish thing to do. Even though we know there was enough food in there for months, even that doesn't matter. We're in an environment where the slightest mistake gets seized upon, and that was just a strategic mistake. It didn't need to happen. And
how long did that last for, and why do you think Israel did that?
I think they were trying to. I can't remember off the top of my head how long it lasted for. I think it might have been a month and a half, but I'd have to check. I think the reason they did it is because they knew Hamas were using the aid supplies to raise their funds, pay their fighters, keep themselves in the fight in many respects. And they thought that by cutting the supply, it would mean that the demand inside escalated, which means Hamas would have to feed people. And yeah, I just think it was fuzzy logic. And as I said, it didn't work anyway. It just got Israel hammered on the world stage. So when it comes to starvation, it just doesn't stack up. And I would recommend you read the paper by Danny Orbach, Jonathan Boxman et al., published by the BISA, the Begin Sadat Center. It's called Refuting the Genocide Allegations. It's the most extensive interrogation of this during the war. And when it comes to headshots and snipers, there's a really good points that they make in that paper. When we have doctors in the New York Times saying we were in hospitals and all we saw was headshots to children and gunshot wounds to children. Unfortunately, that's belied by Hamas's own numbers, because Hamas publish by hospital the number of injuries and the kind and the mechanism of injuries they've been treating. And whilst those doctors were in the Gaza Strip, no hospital in the Strip reported a majority of gunshot wounds, never mind majority gunshot wounds to children. By far and away, the biggest mechanism of injury was airstrike. So, their account of things is belied by Hamas's own data. So it's just a really good example of how you make an allegation, you don't provide any evidence other than anecdotal, especially when you look at who they went to Gaza with, Medical Aid for Palestine, a charity that's been reported for links to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, one of the terror groups. There's straight away there's a bias source, but they say doctor, so they get the halo effect, and then the story goes around the world. But there's actually no evidence. Anecdotal.
Well, they did produce MRIs allegedly of pictures of brains where you could literally see the outline of the bullet inside the brain.
I mean, respectfully, I've seen headshots in real life, and they don't look like that. I'm completely unconvinced by those X-rays.
Yeah, I wondered about that, but I have not seen any headshots.
Yeah,
mercifully.
I've seen a headshot to a 6-year-old, so I actually know what it looks like to a child. It was a ricocheted round to a child in Afghanistan, and I can assure you it doesn't look like anything like those X-rays. So I'm intensely skeptical of those, and I don't believe them.
So, we recently had David Deutsch on the program, the Oxford physicist, talking about what he calls the pattern. The tendency across millennia for people to legitimize the hurting of Jews. And I've been haunted by that. I'm writing a long essay on it. I'm not so interested in talking about whether he's right or not. Let's put that to the side for the moment. Just say what is obvious, that for people of my age, 71 or thereabouts, this is really an unimagined moment in Jewish history. The level of derision, degradation, demonization is a better word, of Israel and of Jews, and of course the violence that has followed that all over the world, not just in Israel, tragically everywhere, especially lately in Australia and Bondi Beach. And David Deutsch points out, and I felt it long before he said it, that what's one of the things that's unusual about this moment is that there are many people who are in support of the Jewish people, who are defending them. And many of them happen to be from England. And so David and I talked about that a little bit, but, I put you in that group with Douglas Murray. That there's anyone is shocking, but that they're two of the most eloquent and, in your case, brave people who've put your own safety at risk to come see what's happening here is really, I'm very grateful for that. So that's my praise. What I'm curious about is, did your attitudes toward Israel and, say, the IDF change with October 7th, change when you came here on those 3 trips, or have you always felt that way, some kind of natural sympathy? Or have you been galvanized in some fashion by the last two plus years?
So straight off the bat, my grandfather was in the US Army in World War II. I know what he was fighting against in Europe, so that's always been kind of something I deeply admired him for, and I feel a sort of legacy to carry on in some way, with this kind of new face of anti-Semitism and Nazism that's reared its head. Secondly, I had a very good Jewish friend who was killed in Afghanistan, Lieutenant Paul Mervis. That's the up to 7th of October. That was the only time I'd ever worn a kippah. I was at his funeral, and I'm very conscious that he gave his life for our country as a Jewish man, and it morally offends me that Jews are presented as anything less than fellow British citizens. That I find that deeply upsetting, and when I think about Paul's memory. And then finally, I worked very hard to get some of our former colleagues out of Afghanistan in 2021 when the Taliban took back over again. We ran a charity, a group of us, and we managed to shift about 3,000 Afghans to safety, mostly women and children. And we couldn't have done it without the Jewish community in the UK, who really helped us with fundraising and some of the legal stuff around it, because actually it's very easy to people traffic accidentally when you're doing this stuff. And if you don't have the legal protection, you can get yourself in trouble. So we couldn't have done any of it without them. And then I saw how 7th of October affected my friends. And then I saw the storm of denial and anti-Semitism that came off the back of it. And I think what got me my first invitation to Israel was primarily my support for the Jewish community in the UK. So in terms of my attitudes to Israel, I've always been kind of a Zionist, if you will. I've always believed in the state of Israel as a thing that needs to be in existence for very important historical reasons. I've always been aware that the IDF go hard when they respond to terror attacks. And look, the law of armed conflict is pretty permissive, and I've got no moral qualms with going hard against terrorists. That doesn't bother me in the slightest. And yeah, but I've always come into this, like I said, with a clear-eyed approach where I know that, look, I studied a psychology's masters because wars are fought by people, and if you can understand the people better, you'll understand the war better. And the psychology when it comes to Gaza or Lebanon and with Israel is no different. You know, there's good, there's bad, and you know you have to take each incident as it comes and judge it on its own merits. So that's kind of my story and how I really got into this. But it all stems from sort of family history, friends, and wanting to live in a world where people can get by without getting abuse based on their religious or ethnic identity.
Well, you're a good man. Paul Mervis, I'm sure, is or would be grateful. I've lost friends, right, who my friendship wasn't sufficient to induce empathy or sympathy for what happened on October 7th. And it's part of this world we're in right now. Having said all that, I want to pivot. We'll come back to the Gaza situation maybe in a minute. But while we're on this topic, you are also, at least in your writing, sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, at least writ large. The narrative, the post-1948 narrative has been incredibly distorted over the last 2 years. But I think any thoughtful person should understand that the people who lived here in 1948 who were not Jewish, particularly the Muslims, the Arab Muslims who had lived here for a long time, had their own nationalist aspirations alongside the Jews who were their neighbors during the British Mandate in the 1919 to 1948 period, where in the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire, where England is present here in Palestine and has a no-win, has a terrible road to hoe, which is they are suddenly in charge of two peoples who are neighbors but not so friendly even then, certainly not friendly then. And the result, we can blame lots of different things for it, but the result is the Jews got a homeland and the Palestinians don't have one. So talk about your own thoughts on, at least philosophically, how you feel about that and where you could imagine it getting resolved someday in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I had an answer to this, I'd be a lot wealthier than I am, and I'd have a lot more imports on the world stage. This is a conundrum that has beaten every diplomat who's taken it on since 1948, and I think the reason for that is because 1948 was so messy. It wasn't a clean handover from A to B. It was, certainly there was, groups like Irgun or Haganah who didn't play the cleanest slate in the run up to independence. And as a Brit, there's a bit of antagonism, not from me personally, because it was decades ago, but certainly people do bring it up quite regularly. There's the Declaration of Independence. There's the attack by the Arabs. There's the Israeli victory. There's what the Palestinians call the Nakba as a result. None of this is clean. None of it gives you nice lines on a map. None of it kind of is not messy, and it's that kind of messiness that has caused the kind of endless conflict ever since. But the article you're alluding to is. I was really looking at the lens through which we try and analyse this problem, and you look at the international law, the UN, and all the arguments that are advanced forward. All the language they use is of colonialism, which was the era in which all of that international law was written. That period post-Civil War, when European empires were rushing.
Post-World War II.
Oh, sorry, yeah, I misspoke. When European powers were rushing to hand their colonies back to the indigenous populations, well, that framing just doesn't work with Israel. Like it's not that you had a bunch of Jewish colonizers from Europe who came in and kicked all the native Arabs off their land where there'd never been any Jews before, and all of a sudden you've got a colony. That doesn't work. What you effectively have is two peoples who both claim indigeneity, who both claim long historical ties to the land. And I'm not going to debate which one is right. I'm not interested in that right now. But let's just, because I think part of this is we all keep trying to rehash the battles of the past rather than deal with what's in front of us right now. And what's in front of us right now is the state of Israel that isn't going anywhere. They've proven that beyond doubt in the last 2 years, that they will fight to the last soldier if need be. And some bases down in the south did that. They fought to the last soldier on 7th of October to defend their land, and that's where we are. So we have to play that. But colonialism narrative doesn't work. And again, this debate, I think quite often pro-Israel advocates fall into the trap I articulated earlier, where you play the enemy's game. When they start using the language of colonialism, many defenders like Natasha Hausdorff regularly uses uti possidetis juris as a kind of counter argument to that. But actually, that's a colonial framework as well. And so,
what is that? What is that concept?
So that is that when a colony was returned to kind of the indigenous population, the borders were as they fell. Like, okay, this is the area that was colonized. These are your borders now, and that's the argument by which the Gaza Strip and Judea and Samaria are considered part of Israel. But again, it's a colonial argument, and Israel is not and never has been, certainly since 1948, a colony of anyone. It's Jews returning to their indigenous homeland, Arabs maintaining that there is a waqf or an Islamic right to the ground, and they also claim a degree of indigeneity, whether that's true or not. So that's the situation as it is, and I think using colonial international law frameworks doesn't solve the problem. And I think part of the reason this is so intractable is people keep using those frameworks and they're not fit for purpose. And perhaps we need a different way of looking at this problem to solve it, rather than tired international law that doesn't really fit.
I encourage listeners to go back and listen to my interview with Chavi Redagor. I think it's called An Extraordinary Introduction to the Conflict in the Middle East, and we'll link to it. It's basically his argument, among others in that piece, is that this is not France and Algeria, a point you make in your piece, where France, after terrorist attacks, eventually says, okay, we give up, you can have it, we'll go home. There's no home for the Jews who live here, Many of them came from Europe. I could go home, sort of, although I did sell my house in Maryland. But many of the Jews who came here in 1948 were refugees from Nazi Germany. If they'd gone home to Poland, some of them were killed there after the war in pogroms. The majority came from Arab countries that expelled them or coerced them out after the establishment of the state. They can't go back to Iraq and Yemen and et cetera. It's not a friendly environment. So it is an intractable problem that we'll see if we make some headway. When things get shaken up, sometimes there's a chance for progress, and the status quo loses some of its power. We'll see what happens. I want to return to your piece on Gaza, and we're going to talk a little bit here about tactics and warfare. The two things I thought were easily accessible to an average person would be the use of drones by Israel, which was probably, I don't know if there's anything comparable to it in modern warfare, and also the way medical treatment was delivered on the battlefield. You wrote something extraordinary on X recently where you said something like 600 Israelis would be dead right now if they had had British level of battlefield medical treatment. So talk about those two, and anything else you want to add that you've learned that you think the West should learn from this urban warfare?
Yeah, so the drones piece is interesting. It's not quite as widespread as Ukraine, and they're used in slightly different ways. So there's a really interesting comparing and contrast. And I haven't done that work yet because that's part of my PhD dissertation. So you have to bear with me until I grind through that one. But drones have been huge force multipliers. They haven't been available to every unit. There's a misconception. Some of the reserve units have actually really struggled for equipment. And one of the lessons is the challenge of mobilizing that many people in that short of amount of time. 360,000 soldiers were mobilized by the IDF. They did not have stocks and supplies for 360,000 soldiers. So that's a really good lesson about the challenges that come with mobilization, and then even how you train 360,000 reservists. Because a lot of them hadn't worn uniform for as much as 3 years, because it's every 3 years they have to report. And yet they only had a month and a half of training before deploying to Gaza. So there was actually quite a lot of on-the-job training done at the start of the war. They were learning in contact. Which led to some mistakes, I would suggest. It led to things perhaps not going as well as it might have done at the start of the war because there were some soldiers lacking training. That's a really important lesson as well. Medical is fascinating. So it's 600 soldiers that would be dead, not only if they've been given current British standards of care, but if they've been given previous Israeli standards of care. So if this had been the Lebanon War 2006, those 600 would be dead. And what's really interesting about the developments in the IDF medical space is how data-driven they are. They've really crunched the numbers on how soldiers were dying, where they were dying, and they've made some brilliant adjustments based on pure data. It's a very mathematical way of looking at it. So they've quite reasonably asked the question, how do soldiers die on the battlefield? And the answer is blood loss. And so the very logical conclusion is, well, why not have blood on the front line? So they've got refrigerated blood packs with the forward fighting units. So when a soldier is wounded, rather than saline or some of the other sort of intravenous stuff they give people, which doesn't clot, which doesn't carry oxygen in the way that blood does, they give them blood. Incredible. No other army that I know of does this outside of special forces. They also looked at where soldiers die. And actually, it's mostly the battlefield. If they're going to die, if they make it to a hospital, they usually survive. The deaths are happening on the battlefield. And so they've taken the doctors out of the hospitals and put them on the battlefield because that's where they're most needed. So, it's developments like this, data-driven, really, really intelligent, using technology. And where they're going is quite remarkable. They're going to be talking about wearable technology that updates an app that everyone in the medical chain can see. So when a casualty comes in, they've already got all their stats there. Then you can factor in AI into that, which will recommend triage and treatment and speed up that process as well and save more lives. This is quite remarkable stuff they're doing. They're even talking about investigating synthetic blood. So you don't have to carry human blood that's been, it can only be O positive because that's the only one that goes with everyone. It's got to be cleared of, potential diseases or, whatever it might be. With synthetic blood, you can just make pure, clean blood that can go into wounded troops. So these are remarkable technological innovations, all data driven. So that was fascinating to me. And actually, the paper that I've already written, I'm just writing an annex to it now about those medical developments, because I only found those out last week. But yeah, there's rafts of lessons here, and some of them are as old as time, like hygiene in the field. Gaza's sewage works were damaged. The soldiers had to find somewhere to do their basic bodily functions. And then if a bulldozer comes on and sweeps that into a sand berm, you're lying on a very contaminated pile of dirt, and people can pick up infections and all that sort of stuff. So even these really, really granular, gritty lessons that probably apply to the Romans just as much as they apply to the IDF in Gaza today. It's always good to have, because we get very excited about future technology, future developments, what's new, what's shiny. Actually, some of these classic soldiering lessons, it does no damage whatsoever to remind ourselves that they're still really important. So I've tried to look at both new and old lessons in the paper quite deliberately.
It feels like this is a one-off war. It's the tunnel aspect of it, the ability of Hamas to pop out and then pop back underneath. Is there going to be another war outside of Gaza in the future that a United States or an England would end up fighting that'll be remotely like this? I mean, the world saw urban warfare in Afghanistan and in the fight against ISIS. Is that day done? Are these lessons relevant for the future?
I love that question, and it's really important. It's a point to hammer home, I think, is that it goes back to my earlier point about what you don't do is you don't lift conflict A and say conflict B will be just like this. The skill of the analyst, and what I've tried to do, is to say, look, these lessons are not going to be the same as Gaza, but here are themes, here are kind of specific data points that will lift and drop across. And I've broken the lessons down into actually you can learn from, you might want to learn from, or you probably don't need to learn from. So I've actually broken them down. But it's not inconceivable that should we end up fighting in Eastern Europe, which looks increasingly likely, quite frankly, or in case we're fighting against the US Army in Greenland, who knows? That there is almost certainly going to be an underground element. Look at the Battle of Stalingrad back in World War II. They were fighting in sewer systems there. This is not new. It's not unlikely. And what we've got from Gaza is the benchmark on how to do it against an enemy that's prepared underground. There's an obstacle every 100 meters. You're trying to maneuver simultaneously with the troops on the surface. You're trying to coordinate your fire supporters as all of that is happening. And it's absolutely conceivable that a NATO force could be doing that in Eastern Europe in due course. Not in the same way, but there are techniques, tactics, procedures that absolutely we can learn from. And on top of that, what the IDF has done in Gaza is what we call combined arms maneuver, where they use the full orchestra of war. They use air support, artillery, mortars, guns, drones, signals intelligence, technological advances, infantry, armor, tanks, you name it. The whole thing it's like the whole orchestra is playing together in that urban setting. British Army hasn't done that since 2007. And even then, that was in a rural environment interspersed with buildings rather than a pure urban environment. And I know because I was on that operation. I did it the last time the British did a battle group assault in that way. That is a lot of skill fade. That means pretty much anyone in the British Army below company commander has never touched this stuff. And there's loads to learn. For example, the IDF had quite high levels of fratricide, of blue on blue at the start of the war. Because it turns out that when you operate in an urban environment, all of a sudden everything is rubble. Nothing looks like it does on your map. You lose track of where the people to the left and the right of you are. And it's very easy to shoot your own troops, but by accident because of the chaos of friction of war that I mentioned earlier. The IDF put some really good measures in on how to deconflict your own call signs when they're moving around on the ground, so you don't actually have that. What a lesson to learn. And we can learn it from the IDF's mistakes so that we don't make those mistakes ourselves. So it's a great opportunity, I think, for any army in the world to learn really, really important lessons in how to operate in an urban environment.
Let's talk about culture, which we've alluded to, and innovation. You talked earlier, I think, about Hamas adjusting its tactics in the beginning of the war. I can't remember. We talked about it in this conversation. I read it in your paper, but Israelis are stereotypically bad at preparing for problems, doing preventive things. Again, this is, I think, a Middle Eastern trait, maybe generally. And we're extraordinary at adapting to problems. The things that are done here, part of it comes from the high-tech culture that a lot of the officers in this war from the reserves are part of. But Israel, as you point out in your paper, made a lot of corrections. You've mentioned a few in the medical area and elsewhere where they adapted. And I'm curious, the other thing Israel, the army is famous for is a delegation of authority to people with better information on the ground and the opportunity to make decisions on their own without having to get them cleared. I'm curious what your experience of that is in your own conversations with soldiers and commanders. Did you get a feel for the Israeli army culture, and how would it differ from your own experience on the ground in, say, Afghanistan? Were there things that shocked you when you were just amazed? I've heard American military experts who came here were very surprised by the lack of uniformity in the uniforms. You know, there'd be soldiers standing around with shirts untucked, and they didn't all the uniforms didn't match, and this would be unheard of in many, many armies. Just give us some reflections on culture here in Israel and how you think it's helped and hampered the IDF response.
The biggest difference, I think, is the fact it's a citizen army that's so heavily reliant on reserves. And I have noticed differences in quality and performance between the high-end professional units and some of the reserve units. That's really interesting. And look, it gives a lot kind of a flatter command structure in the IDF. It's a very much a people's army, where our armies are very regimented and rank orientated. My regiment is quite relaxed in that regards, and we encourage our soldiers to speak up and chip in ideas and that kind of thing. But the IDF takes that to a whole new level, and that's interesting to watch. I don't think the IDF is quite as disciplined as Western armies tend to be. I've noticed that when I've been out with them. But it seems to work, and that's the important thing. It's like, does it work? Yes, it does. Then great. But it also has created some problems. You know, if we look at how soldiers have taken their phones into Gaza when they're not supposed to, they've made stupid videos and messed around in people's houses. You know, it comes nowhere close to the threshold of war crime, but the optics are incredibly poor. And also, when you have a reserve army, it's very difficult to discipline them, because you can go, hey, I'm going to sack you, and they're like, brilliant, I can go home now. This is great. So there are challenges there. I do like how well the Israelis do what we would call mission command, what the Germans would have called Auftragstaktik. The way they empower down to the lowest level, and we call it mission command. Actually, it's just command done well, and it does seem to work and have effects. And the other really good bonus from a citizen army is that you have some incredibly well qualified, very junior soldiers. Like, I have a friend; he's a machine gunner in I won't mention his unit, but he's a machine gunner as a grunt, and the guy's just finishing off his higher mathematics masters. You know, this is the single brightest, most intelligent machine gunner I've ever met in my life. And I can only imagine having someone like that as a platoon commander or a company commander. That would add enormous value to have someone that bright at the lowest level you could go to and get ideas from, and get trust when you give them a mission and know how that goes. But the final observation is armies are made up of people. The IDF has some outstanding people, some good people, some average people, and some mediocre people, and almost certainly some bad people, because that's just humanity. And then actually, if you're recruiting from across your whole society, you're going to get a reflection of your whole society. So I find the differences interesting. I find them sometimes a little bit maddening. But what I'm really interested in is does the army work or not? And it does. So, whatever they're doing culturally is obviously working for them.
Before we close, is there a story you could tell from your experiences on the ground that moved you or shocked you or taught you something that you didn't expect to learn? Just something surprising or extraordinary?
Yeah, there was one thing that really jumped out was when I went to Netzarim Corridor. I was with 252 Division, which is a reserve division. And it was classic kind of IDF disorganization that they obviously weren't expecting us. We sort of rocked up with our escorts. It took us ages to get in. We were waiting around for hours and hours and hours. We eventually got driven in, and everyone just looked at us in a really confused way, like, what on earth are you doing here? They then had to trawl the camp to find a tiny handful of English speakers, maybe 5 or 10. That's all they could find. And so that's how I know this wasn't staged or laid on, which was why it sort of had meaning. And we interviewed all of them. And what really impressed me was the unity of purpose. Like, every single soldier understood why they were there. None of them wanted to be there. None of them, on 6th of October 2023 had any desire to go to Gaza and do anything. But they understood the importance of the mission for the defense of their country. And they came across so compassionate when it came to talking about the civilians, actually. I was really surprised. And look, I've never bought into the genocide narrative or the systematic war crimes piece, but, the fact that unprompted, clearly unbriefed, clearly not expecting an interview with some random British guy, all of them expressed this compassion and regret for what was happening, but also understood why it was happening. I just compare and contrast that with, firstly, my own troops who, never fought in a war of that nature. And I think back to how difficult it was as a commander to kind of explain why we were in Afghanistan, because frankly, half the time I wasn't sure, because they changed it every 10 minutes. First of all, we were anti-narcotics, then we were supporting the government, then we were there to protect the people. It just changed every tour I went on. But the IDF didn't have that, and their soldiers had that real unity. And it just, it was quite humbling to see people from all walks of life just having dropped their day life to go and defend their country. It was a really commendable thing, and I find that quite moving. And I really hope it's something that we could replicate in the UK should that ever come to us. But I'm actually not convinced that we could. So that was quite sobering, and certainly is an experience that stayed with me.
My guest today has been Andrew Fox. Andrew, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you for having me. Always great to be here.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.